The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, a small roadside restaurant just outside Camp Pendleton. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez pulled his beat-up Honda Civic into a space near the back, his movements careful and deliberate. Every step sent sharp reminders through his left leg, where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone 6 months earlier in Fallujah. Marcus had been coming to Murphy's every Tuesday for the past 3 weeks, ever since his medical leave began. The doctor said he needed time to heal, both physically and mentally, before they could determine if he'd ever return to active duty. The uncertainty ate at him more than the pain in his leg ever could. He pushed through the glass door, the familiar jingle of the bell announcing his arrival. The diner smelled of coffee and bacon grease, a comforting aroma that reminded him of weekend mornings back home in Texas before everything changed. Before the IED, before watching his best friend die in his arms, before the nightmares that made sleep feel like an enemy. "Morning, hon," called out Dolores, the elderly waitress who had served him every week. Her genuine smile was one of the few bright spots in his routine. "Your usual table?" Marcus nodded, making his way to the corner booth that gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot. Old habits from combat zones died hard. Dolores didn't need to ask what he wanted: black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and a side of hash browns he rarely finished. The diner was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning. A group of construction workers occupied the large round table near the window, their hard hats and reflective vests draped over chair backs. A few truckers sat at the counter, nursing coffee and sharing road stories. In the opposite corner, 4 young men in expensive polo shirts and khakis laughed loudly over their breakfast. Marcus tried to focus on his coffee, but their voices carried across the small space. They looked to be in their early 20s, probably college students from UC San Diego, on their way to somewhere more exciting than a roadside diner. Their conversation centered around spring break plans, expensive cars, and weekend parties in La Jolla. "I can't believe my dad is making me work at the dealership this summer," complained one of them, a blond kid with a perfect tan and designer sunglasses hanging from his shirt. "I told him I needed the summer to recover from final stress." "At least you don't have to work," replied another, this one with carefully styled dark hair and a watch that probably cost more than Marcus made in 2 months. "My internship at the law firm is going to be so boring. All I'll do is file papers and get coffee for the real lawyers." Marcus couldn't help but think about the 19-year-old Marines he'd served with, kids who faced death daily while these college students complained about summer jobs and finals stress. He took a sip of his coffee and tried to tune them out. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister back in San Antonio. "How are you doing, hermano? Mom's worried about you. Call when you can." Marcus stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How could he explain that some days he felt like he was drowning? That he woke up every night in a cold sweat, hearing echoes of explosions and gunfire? That he felt guilty for surviving when better Marines hadn't made it home? "Excuse me," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see the blonde college student standing beside his table, a smirk on his face. "My friends and I were wondering, are you like a soldier or something? We saw you limping when you came in." The question caught Marcus off guard. He set down his phone and looked at the young man. "Marine," he said simply. "Oh, cool," the kid said, but his tone suggested he found it anything but cool. "Did you get hurt playing war games or something? My cousin went through basic training and said it was mostly just running around and pretending to be tough." Marcus felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Something like that." The college student didn't seem to pick up on the warning in Marcus's tone. Instead, he turned back to his friends, speaking loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Guys, check it out. We've got a real-life action hero over here. Bet he's got some crazy stories about crawling through the mud and shooting targets." His friends laughed, and Marcus felt every eye in the diner turn toward him. The construction workers looked uncomfortable, and even Dolores paused in pouring coffee to glance over with concern. "I mean, no offense," the blonde continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "But don't you think all that military stuff is kind of outdated? Like, we have drones and smart bombs now. Do we really need guys running around with guns anymore?" Marcus gripped his coffee cup tighter, his knuckles turning white. He thought about Private Johnson, barely 18, who had thrown himself on a grenade to save their squad. About Corporal Martinez, who had carried wounded civilians to safety under enemy fire. About all the Marines who had given everything for people like this kid to sit safely in diners and mock what they didn't understand. "I mean," the college student pressed on, emboldened by his friend's laughter, "what do you actually do all day? March around and follow orders? Seems pretty mindless to me. I'm studying economics at UCSD, using my brain to solve real problems." The diner had gone quiet, except for the soft hiss of the griddle. Even the truckers had stopped talking to listen. Marcus could feel his heart pounding, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat. But this wasn't combat. This was just an ignorant kid who had never seen real consequences for his words. Marcus started to stand, his injured leg protesting as he put weight on it. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he needed to move before he said something he'd regret. The blonde student took a step back, perhaps finally sensing that he'd pushed too far. "Look, I didn't mean anything personal," the kid said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "I'm sure what you do is important to some people. I just think there are smarter ways to serve your country, like going to college, getting a real education, contributing to society in meaningful ways." "Meaningful ways?" Marcus repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, exactly," the student said, missing the danger in Marcus's tone entirely. "I mean, anyone can learn to shoot a gun and follow orders. It takes real intelligence to solve complex problems, to lead in the business world, to make the kind of money that actually matters." Marcus felt something snap inside him. Not the explosive anger he sometimes feared, but something colder and more dangerous. He straightened to his full height, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow over the much smaller college student. "You want to know what I do?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "I led Marines in combat. Kids younger than you who had more courage in their little finger than you'll ever have. I watched my best friend die trying to save Iraqi children from a car bomb. I've carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire because leaving someone behind isn't an option where I come from." The blonde student's face had gone pale, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You think following orders is mindless? Try making split-second decisions when people's lives depend on you. Try leading men into situations where you might not come back, but you go anyway because it's your duty. Try sleeping at night when you've seen what real evil looks like. When you've held dying kids in your arms and wondered if the world is worth saving." The student tried to speak, but Marcus held up a hand. "And you know what the really funny part is? I did it all so that spoiled little boys like you could sit in diners and talk about how much smarter you are than the people who keep you safe. So you could worry about summer internships instead of whether you'll live to see tomorrow." The silence in the diner was deafening. The blonde student looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His friends had stopped laughing and were staring at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their half-eaten eggs. I didn't know," the student stammered. "I mean, I wasn't trying to—" "You weren't trying to what?" Marcus asked. "Show respect? Show gratitude? Or were you just not trying to think about the cost of your freedom?" Dolores approached cautiously, her hand gentle on Marcus's arm. "Han, maybe you should sit back down," she said softly. "Let me get you some fresh coffee." Marcus looked around the diner, suddenly aware that everyone was watching him. The construction workers nodded respectfully. And one of the truckers raised his coffee cup in a small salute, But Marcus felt exposed, like he'd revealed too much of the raw pain he carried. He pulled out a $10 bill and placed it on the table, more than enough to cover his barely touched breakfast. "Thanks, Dolores. I should go." As he turned to leave, the blonde student grabbed his sleeve. "Wait, please. I really didn't mean to disrespect you. I don't know anyone in the military. I don't understand what you guys go through." Marcus paused, looking down at the young man's hand on his arm, then at his face. For the first time, he saw something other than arrogance there. Fear, yes, but also what might have been genuine regret. "No," Marcus said quietly. "You don't understand, and I hope you never have to." He limped toward the door, each step a reminder of the price he'd paid for this kid's ignorance. Behind him, he heard the blonde student's friends hissing angry whispers about embarrassment and ruining their morning. But he also heard the student himself say more quietly, "I think I really messed up." Outside, Marcus sat in his car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to steady his breathing. The confrontation had shaken something loose inside him, memories and emotions he worked hard to keep buried. He thought about calling his sister, or maybe Dr. Peterson, the VA counselor who kept telling him that anger was part of the healing process. Instead, he started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, not knowing that 3 vehicles back, a black SUV with government plates had been watching the entire scene through the diner's windows. The occupants had heard every word, seen every gesture, and were already reaching for their phones to make some very important calls. Marcus drove home to his small apartment, unaware that his quiet act of standing up for his service and his fallen brothers had set in motion events that would change everything. Sometimes the most important moments happen in the smallest places, witnessed by people you never expected to care. The diner returned to its normal buzz of conversation, but the college students finished their breakfast in uncomfortable silence. The blonde student, whose name was Bradley Patterson III, kept replaying the Marine's words in his head, seeing for the first time the hollow look in his eyes, the careful way he moved, the weight he seemed to carry in his shoulders. For the first time in his privileged life, Bradley began to understand that his freedom and comfort had come at a price paid by strangers, and that maybe, just maybe, he owed those strangers something more than mockery. But the story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Bradley Patterson III couldn't stop thinking about the Marine's eyes. 3 days had passed since the incident at Murphy's Diner, but those hollow, pain-filled eyes haunted his thoughts. He'd tried to push it away, to return to his normal routine of classes, parties, and complaints about his easy life. But something had shifted inside him. His friends had moved on quickly. Tyler, the one with the expensive watch, had actually bragged to other students about how they'd put some military meathead in his place. Connor and Jake, the other 2 who'd been at the diner, seemed to think the whole thing was hilarious in retrospect. They'd turned it into a story about how they'd stood up to an unstable veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. But Bradley couldn't shake the memory of the Marine's words. "I did it all so that spoiled little boys like you could sit in diners and talk about how much smarter you are than the people who keep you safe." That evening, Bradley found himself researching the Marine's unit patch he'd glimpsed on the man's jacket. It led him down a rabbit hole of military websites, casualty reports, and news articles about the war in Iraq. For the first time in his life, he began to understand the reality of what soldiers faced overseas. He learned about IEDs, improvised explosive devices that killed and maimed American troops daily. He read about Marines who were barely 18 years old, leading patrols through hostile territory where death waited around every corner. He found stories of incredible heroism, of young men throwing themselves into danger to save their brothers, of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The more he read, the more ashamed he felt about his behavior at the diner. Meanwhile, across town in a nondescript office building near the naval base, Chief Petty Officer Jake Hawkeye Morrison was reviewing a very interesting report. Morrison was part of an elite SEAL team that had recently returned from a classified mission in Afghanistan. The team was currently on temporary assignment stateside, conducting training exercises and participating in community outreach programs. The report on his desk came from an unexpected source, the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. It wasn't about terrorism, though. It was about a Marine veteran named Marcus Rodriguez, who had been spotted having what appeared to be a confrontational encounter with civilians at a local diner. The initial report had flagged the incident as a potential concern about veteran mental health. But as Morrison read deeper, he realized the truth was quite different. The surveillance team had recorded audio of the entire conversation, and what they'd captured wasn't the rantings of an unstable veteran, but the dignified response of a combat hero being mocked by ignorant civilians. Morrison knew Marcus Rodriguez by reputation. The Marine had earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star with Combat 5 for his actions in Fallujah. He'd led his squad through some of the heaviest fighting of the war, and his leadership had saved dozens of lives. The fact that he was now being disrespected by college kids who'd never faced anything harder than a difficult exam made Morrison's blood boil. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Echo Team, this is Morrison," he said when the call connected. "I need the team to meet tonight. We've got a situation that requires our attention." 2 hours later, 4 of the Navy's most elite warriors sat around a table in a secure briefing room. Besides Morrison, there was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Chen, the team's intelligence specialist, Petty Officer First Class Miguel Ghost Santos, their communications expert, and Senior Chief Petty Officer David Diesel Thompson, a demolition specialist who looked like he could bench press a small car. Morrison briefed them on the situation with Marcus Rodriguez and played the audio recording from the diner. By the time he finished, the room was silent, except for the quiet hum of air conditioning. "Those little punk kids have no idea what that Marine went through," Ghost said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Rodriguez lost half his squad in that IED blast. I read the after-action report. He carried 3 wounded Marines to safety under heavy fire, then went back for the bodies of his friends." Phoenix nodded grimly. "And now he's dealing with PTSD and a permanent leg injury, trying to figure out if his military career is over, and some spoiled college brats think it's funny to mock him." "What's our move, Chief?" Diesel asked. Morrison had been their team leader for 8 years, and they all trusted his judgment implicitly. Morrison leaned back in his chair, a plan already forming in his mind. "We're going to teach those kids a lesson about respect, but we're going to do it the right way. No intimidation, no threats, nothing that crosses any lines. We're going to show them who they were really talking to and what real service looks like." The team spent the next hour planning their approach. They would start by learning everything they could about the 4 college students, particularly Bradley Patterson, who seemed to be the ringleader. Then they would arrange what appeared to be a chance encounter, but was actually a carefully orchestrated educational experience. Over the next 2 days, Ghost used his considerable skills to gather intelligence on the 4 students. What he found painted a clear picture of privileged young men who had never faced real hardship or responsibility. Bradley was the son of a wealthy car dealership owner, Tyler came from a family of lawyers, Connor's father was a tech executive, and Jake's family owned several restaurants in San Diego. None of them had ever held a real job. None of them had ever been in a situation where their actions had serious consequences. They lived in a bubble of comfort and safety, completely insulated from the harsh realities that people like Marcus Rodriguez faced every day. The SEALs' plan began on Thursday evening. Bradley and his friends had a standing tradition of going to an upscale sports bar called the Admiral's Club every Thursday night. It was the kind of place that attracted young professionals and college students with money to burn, exactly the sort of establishment that would also appeal to off-duty military personnel. The Admirals Club was crowded when Bradley and his friends arrived at 8 o'clock. They claimed their usual high-top table near the big screen TV and ordered their usual round of expensive craft beers. Tyler was in the middle of complaining about his organic chemistry professor when Bradley noticed 4 people at the bar who stood out from the typical crowd. They weren't dressed in uniform, but everything about them screamed military. The way they stood, the way they scanned the room, the quiet confidence in their movements. One was a woman with short black hair and intense eyes, flanked by 3 men who looked like they could handle themselves in any situation. "Check out the tough guys at the bar," Tyler said, following Bradley's gaze. "Probably more military wannabes trying to impress college girls." But Bradley didn't respond. Something about these 4 was different from the broken-down Marine they'd encountered at the diner. These people radiated a quiet, professional danger that made him instinctively uncomfortable. The group at the bar seemed to be having a normal conversation, but Bradley noticed that the woman kept glancing in their direction. Not obviously, just quick looks that lasted a fraction of a second. After about 20 minutes, she walked over to their table. "Excuse me," she said politely, "but my friends and I were wondering if you could settle a debate for us. We heard you guys talking about the military the other day at Murphy's Diner, and we're curious about your perspective." Bradley felt his stomach drop. How did she know about the diner? "I'm sorry, do we know you?" "Not yet," the woman replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Sarah. My friends and I serve in the Navy. We were hoping you might join us for a drink and share your thoughts about military service. You seem to have some strong opinions." Tyler, ever the loudmouth, jumped in before Bradley could respond. "Sure. We'd love to educate you about the real world. Most military people don't understand how things actually work in modern society." Sarah's smile grew wider and somehow more dangerous. "Perfect. Let me introduce you to my team." Within minutes, Bradley and his friends found themselves at a larger table with 4 of the most intimidating people they'd ever met. Sarah introduced her companions as Jake, Miguel, and David, but didn't mention ranks or specialties. She ordered a round of drinks for everyone and then settled back in her chair. "So," she began conversationally, "tell us about your encounter with the Marine at Murphy's Diner. What exactly did you think of him?" Bradley shot warning looks at his friends, but Tyler was already launching into his version of events. "Look, I'm sure he's a nice guy and everything, but he was way out of line. We were just having a conversation about military spending and whether we really need all these soldiers running around playing war games. The guy completely lost it and started screaming at us about his service." Jake, the SEAL team leader, nodded thoughtfully. "Screaming, you say? That must have been scary." "It was," Connor chimed in. "The guy was obviously unstable. Probably PTSD or something. He was limping around, making threats, talking about killing people. Honestly, I think someone should have called the police." The 4 SEALs exchanged quick glances. Miguel leaned forward, his voice deceptively casual. "Killing people? That's interesting. What exactly did he say about that?" "He was bragging about combat and shooting enemies and all that macho military stuff," Jake added. "Like we were supposed to be impressed that he knew how to use a gun." David, the big demolitions expert, spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly over the noise of the bar. "You know, it's funny you mention shooting enemies. In my experience, real combat veterans don't usually brag about killing. It's not something most of them enjoy talking about." "Well, this guy did," Tyler insisted. "He was all about how tough he was, how much training he'd had, how dangerous he was. Total testosterone overload." Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through something, then looked back up at the college students. "Just to clarify, you're talking about Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, correct?" The sudden use of specific military terminology and Rodriguez's full name hit the table like a physical blow. Bradley felt the blood drain from his face. "How do you know his name?" "Oh, we know quite a lot about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Jake said, his casual tone taking on an edge. "We also have a recording of your entire conversation at the diner. Would you like to hear it?" The college students sat in stunned silence as Jake pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Their own voices filled the air, crystal clear and devastating in their ignorance and arrogance. They heard themselves mocking military service, calling soldiers mindless, suggesting that real intelligence lay in business and economics rather than in the life and death decisions of combat. But more importantly, they heard Marcus Rodriguez's response. Not the aggressive rant they'd described to their friends, but the quiet, dignified words of a man who had sacrificed everything for his country and watched his best friend die in service to strangers. When the recording ended, the table was silent. Even Tyler, usually quick with a comeback, had nothing to say. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said quietly, "is one of the finest Marines this country has ever produced. He led his men through 17 combat missions in some of the most dangerous territory in Iraq. He earned a Purple Heart when an IED tore through his left leg and killed his best friend. He earned a Bronze Star with Combat 5 when he carried 3 wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire, then went back for the bodies of the dead." She paused to let that sink in, then continued. "The mindless soldier you mocked has saved more lives than you can count. The man you called unstable showed more restraint and dignity in that diner than any of you have shown in your entire privileged lives." Miguel picked up the narrative. "You want to know what real intelligence looks like? It's making split-second decisions when mortars are falling around you. It's calculating angles of fire while bullets are flying overhead. It's knowing how to treat a sucking chest wound in the middle of a firefight. It's leading terrified 19-year-old kids into combat and bringing as many of them home as possible." David's massive hands were clenched on the table. "You think following orders is mindless? Try following orders when those orders might get you killed, but you follow them anyway because lives depend on it. Try giving orders when you know you're sending good people into danger, but the mission is more important than your feelings." "And you know what's really amazing?" Jake added. "After everything Rodriguez has been through, after all the sacrifices he's made, he's still polite enough to call you sir if you met him on the street, because that's the kind of man the Marines made him. That's what real honor looks like." Bradley found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you people?" Sarah smiled, but this time it was completely cold. "We're Navy SEALs. We're the people who handle the missions that are too dangerous for regular military. We're the ones they call when American lives are on the line and failure isn't an option." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "And we're the people who are very, very disappointed in how you treated one of our brothers." The college students looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. The casual, friendly atmosphere of the bar suddenly felt charged with danger. Other patrons had begun to notice the tension at their table. "Look," Bradley said, his voice shaking slightly. "We didn't know. We made a mistake." "We're sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," Jake said flatly. "Sorry doesn't undo the disrespect you showed to a genuine American hero. Sorry doesn't take back the mockery you made of his service and his sacrifice." "But you're going to make it right," Sarah added, "because you're going to learn what real service means. You're going to understand the price that people like Staff Sergeant Rodriguez pay for your freedom." She stood up from the table, and the other 3 SEALs rose with her. "Tomorrow morning, 0600 hours, Torrey Pines State Beach, South parking lot. You're going to get a small taste of what military training actually involves. And then you're going to apologize to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez properly." "What if we don't show up?" Tyler asked, trying to sound defiant but failing miserably. Miguel smiled for the first time that evening, and it was not a pleasant sight. Trust me, you'll show up, because if you don't, this conversation is going to seem like the friendliest chat you've ever had. The four SEALs walked away, leaving the college students sitting in stunned silence. Around them, the normal sounds of the bar, laughter, conversation, clinking glasses, seemed muted and distant. "What just happened?" Connor whispered. Bradley stared at the recorder Jake had left on the table, still trying to process everything they'd learned. "I think," he said slowly, "we just found out how badly we screwed up." None of them slept well that night, and all four of them would be at Torrey Pines State Beach at 6 in the morning whether they wanted to be or not. The SEALs had made that much perfectly clear. The morning fog hung thick over Torrey Pines State Beach at 5:45 a.m., creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed fitting for what was about to unfold. Bradley Patterson sat in his BMW in the south parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Tyler, Connor, and Jake sat in uncomfortable silence, all of them wondering what they'd gotten themselves into. None of them had slept more than a few hours. They'd spent the night researching the four people they'd met at the bar, and what they'd found had only made their situation worse. Sarah Chen wasn't just any Navy SEAL. She was Lieutenant Commander Chen, one of the first women to complete SEAL training and a veteran of multiple classified missions. Jake Morrison was a decorated Chief Petty Officer with 15 years of special operations experience. Miguel Santos and David Thompson were legends in the special operations community, with service records that read like action movie scripts. These weren't just military personnel. These were some of America's most elite warriors, and the college students had somehow managed to earn their undivided attention in the worst possible way. "Maybe they won't show up," Connor whispered hopefully. His hope died as four figures emerged from the fog like ghosts materializing from another dimension. The SEALs wore simple black workout clothes, but they moved with the fluid precision of predators. Each step was purposeful, each glance calculated. They approached the car with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle any situation. Jake Morrison tapped on the driver's side window. "Out," he said simply. The college students climbed out of the BMW, shivering in the cold morning air. They'd dressed in whatever workout clothes they could find, expensive gym gear that looked ridiculous compared to the SEALs' simple, functional attire. "Follow me," Sarah said, turning toward a path that led down to the beach. "And keep up." The next hour was unlike anything the four young men had ever experienced. The SEALs didn't yell or scream like drill instructors in movies. Instead, they spoke in calm, professional tones that somehow made their commands even more intimidating. They started with basic exercises, push-ups, sit-ups, and running on the soft sand that made every step twice as difficult as normal. Within 20 minutes, all four college students were gasping for breath and drenched in sweat, while the SEALs barely seemed winded. "This is just the warm-up," Miguel explained as Tyler collapsed face first into the sand after attempting his 15th push-up. "In real training, we'd just be getting started." David had them practice basic military formations and movements, teaching them how to move as a team rather than four separate individuals. "Military service isn't about individual heroics," he explained as he corrected Connor's stance for the 10th time. "It's about working together, trusting your brothers, and putting the mission above your personal comfort." But the real education came when they sat in a circle on the beach, watching the sun rise over the Pacific Ocean. Sarah began to tell them stories, not the sanitized, heroic versions they might see in movies, but the raw, honest truth about what military service really meant. She told them about Rodriguez's deployment to Fallujah, about the morning his convoy hit the IED that changed everything. She described how he'd pulled his unconscious driver from the burning Humvee, then gone back for the gunner who was trapped under twisted metal. how he'd organized the defense of their position while wounded, coordinating with air support and calling in medical evacuation. "The interesting thing about courage," she said, looking directly at Bradley, "is that it's not the absence of fear. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was terrified that morning. He told his squad leader later that he was sure he was going to die, but he did his job anyway because that's what Marines do." Jake picked up the narrative. "You want to know about intelligence? Rodriguez had to calculate fields of fire while his leg was bleeding, coordinate with multiple aircraft while under enemy fire, and make life-and-death decisions while in shock from his injuries. All of this while knowing his best friend was already dead." Miguel described the aftermath, how Rodriguez had refused medical attention until all his Marines were accounted for, how he'd insisted on helping to load the casualties onto the medevac helicopters, despite his own wounds. He was more concerned about his men than himself. Even while he was bleeding, even while he was in pain, his first priority was taking care of his Marines. David's voice was quiet when he spoke about the cost. "Rodriguez hasn't had a full night's sleep since that day. He wakes up in cold sweats, hearing explosions that aren't there. He questions every decision he made, wondering if he could have saved more lives. The physical wounds will heal eventually, but the mental ones last forever." By the time the SEALs finished their stories, all 4 college students were crying. Not the embarrassed tears of physical exhaustion, but the deep, gut-wrenching sobs that come from finally understanding the magnitude of your mistakes. "We didn't know," Bradley whispered through his tears. "We had no idea." "No," Sarah agreed. "You didn't know, but that's not an excuse. Ignorance doesn't justify disrespect, especially when that ignorance is willful. You chose not to know. You chose to mock what you didn't understand rather than trying to learn." Jake stood up and looked out at the ocean. Every day, people like Staff Sergeant Rodriguez put their lives on the line for strangers. They miss birthdays and holidays. They sacrifice their safety and comfort. They carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, and they do it so that people like you can sit in diners and complain about summer internships. "What do we do?" Connor asked. "How do we make this right?" "You start by understanding what you've done," Miguel replied. "You disrespected a genuine American hero. You mocked his service, his sacrifice, and his pain. You turned his suffering into entertainment for your friends." David nodded toward the parking lot. "But you're going to have a chance to apologize. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is waiting in the parking lot right now." The college students' heads snapped up in shock. Through the morning mist, they could see a figure leaning against a Honda Civic, his silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. "He doesn't know why he's here," Sarah explained. "We told him we had some information about his benefits claim and asked him to meet us. He has no idea what this is really about." "What if he doesn't want to hear our apology?" Bradley asked. "Then you'll have learned another important lesson about consequences," Jake replied. "Real apologies aren't about making you feel better. They're about acknowledging the harm you've caused and accepting responsibility for it." The walk back to the parking lot felt like the longest journey of their lives. Marcus Rodriguez stood exactly where they'd last seen him, but now they saw him with completely different eyes. Instead of a broken-down soldier, they saw a wounded warrior. Instead of someone to mock, they saw someone to honor. Marcus looked up as they approached, his expression wary when he recognized the 4 college students. His hand instinctively moved toward his phone, probably ready to call for help if things got ugly. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said formally, "these young men have something they need to say to you." Marcus looked between the SEALs and the college students, clearly confused by the situation. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what's going on here." Bradley stepped forward, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. Every word the SEALs had told them about this man's service and sacrifice was running through his head. The magnitude of what they'd done at the diner hit him with fresh force. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," he began, his voice cracking with emotion. My friends and I owe you the deepest apology. What we said to you at the diner was inexcusable. We disrespected you, your service, and the sacrifice you've made for our country." Marcus's expression softened slightly, but he remained guarded. "You don't need to." "Yes, we do," Tyler interrupted, stepping up beside Bradley. For once in his life, the arrogant young man looked genuinely humble. "We need to apologize, and you need to hear it. What we said was ignorant and cruel. We had no right to mock your service or question your intelligence." Connor and Jake joined them, forming a line in front of the Marine. "We've spent the morning learning about what you really did in Iraq," Connor said. "About your Bronze Star and Purple Heart, about how you saved your Marines under fire. We learned that you're not just a soldier, you're a hero. And we learned that we're exactly what you said we were," Jake added. "Spoiled little boys who don't understand the price of freedom." Marcus looked at each of them in turn, then at the 4 SEALs standing behind them. Understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "You set this up," he said to Sarah. "These young men needed to learn about respect," she replied. "And you deserved better than what they gave you at the diner." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying the college students' faces. They could see him processing what had happened, weighing their words against their previous actions. "I appreciate the apology," he said finally, "but you need to understand something. I didn't serve for gratitude or recognition. I served because it was my duty, because my country needed me, because it was the right thing to do." He straightened to his full height, and for the first time, the college students could see the leader he'd been in combat. "But what you did at the diner wasn't just disrespectful to me. It was disrespectful to every person who's ever worn a uniform, to everyone who's ever made a sacrifice for something bigger than themselves." "We understand that now," Bradley said, "and we want to make it right, not just with you, but with other veterans. We want to learn more, to do better." Marcus studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Learning is good, but learning without action is worthless. If you really want to make this right, prove it." Over the next several weeks, the 4 college students did exactly that. Bradley started volunteering at the local VA hospital, helping with recreational therapy for wounded veterans. Tyler used his family's legal connections to provide free legal assistance to veterans navigating disability claims. Connor organized fundraisers at UC San Diego for veteran support organizations. Jake began working at a local food bank that served military families in need. But more importantly, they became advocates for veteran awareness on their campus. They organized speaker events where veterans could share their stories, started a scholarship fund for children of fallen service members, and worked to educate other students about the reality of military service. Marcus Rodriguez became a regular visitor to their events, not as the bitter, wounded warrior they'd first encountered, but as a proud Marine sharing his experiences and helping others understand the true cost of freedom. His leg still gave him pain. His nights were still haunted by nightmares, but he'd found a new purpose in education and outreach. The SEAL team watched from a distance, satisfied that their unconventional lesson had achieved its purpose. They'd turned 4 ignorant college students into advocates for veteran awareness, and they'd given a wounded warrior a chance to heal through service to others. 6 months after that morning on the beach, Bradley Patterson received an unexpected phone call. It was Marcus Rodriguez, calling to tell him that he'd been cleared to return to active duty. The Marine was being assigned to a training position where he could share his combat experience with the next generation of warriors. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "What started as the worst day I'd had in months turned into something that gave me hope again. You and your friends showed me that people can change, that mistakes can become opportunities to do better." Bradley wiped away tears as he listened. Thank you for giving us the chance to make it right, for showing us what real strength looks like. Just keep doing what you're doing, Marcus replied. Keep learning, keep serving, keep honoring the sacrifice that others have made. That's how you really make it right. As Bradley hung up the phone, he looked around his dorm room at the pictures and certificates from his volunteer work at the VA hospital. On his desk was a framed photo from Marcus's promotion ceremony, where the Marine had asked him and his friends to be present as he received his new assignment. It had been the proudest moment of Bradley's life, not because of anything he'd accomplished, but because he'd been deemed worthy to witness the success of a genuine hero. The incident at Murphy's Diner had started as an ugly display of ignorance and privilege. But thanks to 4 Navy SEALs who cared enough to teach rather than punish, it had become a story of redemption, education, and the power of second chances. Sometimes the most important lessons come from our worst mistakes. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to turn those mistakes into something meaningful. The Marine who'd been mocked for his service had found new purpose. The college students who'd shown such disrespect had become champions for veteran awareness, and the SEALs who'd witnessed injustice had chosen education over revenge, proving that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to build something better. In the end, everyone had learned the true meaning of respect. Not just the respect owed to those who serve, but the respect we owe to each other as human beings trying to do better than we did yesterday.